Hello, I'm Kai Rosga, and welcome to Version Up, one lawyer's journey to digitally transform his legal practice. Welcome, and thanks for listening. Today, I have on the pod legal tech guru and advisor Emma Kelly. Emma has a deep background in helping lawyers streamline their practice with technology. We talk about how to find fit-for-purpose legal tech solutions, the business challenges of deploying these tools at large corporate law firms, and how AI will change what a law firm is, and hopefully in the process expand access to legal services. As always, views expressed here are my own. Hope you enjoy. Hi, Emma. Welcome to the pod.
Hey, Kai. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Really excited to have you. And I thought we'd kick it off by just learning a little bit more about you, what your current job is and your legal tech journey.
Yeah, no, thank you. So my name's Emma Kelly. I've been in the legal industry for almost 20 years at this point. It's just a little unbelievable whenever I say that out loud. So I've been in legal for a long time, not as an attorney, but in various roles at both vendors and law firms. So I started off my career as a law librarian at Covington and Burling. I was there for about 5 years. Learned a lot about the ins and outs of law firms, knowledge management, really seeing the beginning of a lot of the new tools coming out of Westlaw and Lexis and a lot of new research tools. I was getting a little antsy, wanted to try something different. So from there, I moved over to a media company where I was tasked with helping to develop and launch their antitrust product. From there, I did a lot of product development and worked on the editorial side as well. I like to joke that it's also actually my villain origin story because from there I moved to business development. So I was there for about 5 years, very fun. From there, I made the leap to a GovTech startup, super fun being a startup environment. But I was really missing working directly with lawyers and getting into the nitty gritty. So I moved over to TransPerfect, where I was for about 6 or 7 years and got really heavily involved in e-discovery, mostly, as well as on the translation side of things and then report reporting, management. And that was really fun because I got to work directly with attorneys, well, some law firms and in-house counsel. I started to get antsy. I tend to get a 5 to 7 year itch, it seems like. So moved from there to a voice tech AI startup, was there for a little bit, to another e-discovery company, was there for a little bit, but still getting antsy and realizing I wasn't quite scratching my itch. And there's so many cool things happening right now in legal technology. I thought to myself, I got to just put my hamstring wheel out. So right now I have a couple of different ventures going on. I founded my own consulting company, ProdK. I consult with legal technology companies on their go-to-market strategy. So that can mean marketing, business development, things of that nature. And then I'm also working on a venture, Sabio, to evaluate both the LLMs themselves as well as products that use AI specifically. So it's not quite benchmarking, but evaluation that way.
That is a true 360-degree
I know.
covering of the space. I want to ask you first about the TransPerfect experience
Yeah.
because my formative years as a lawyer were working at a big law firm, doing big litigation, big cartel investigations on the antitrust side. So a lot of discovery, a lot of experience with e-discovery vendors, including TransPerfect. Great vendor, great experience. So I think back now on that and see e-discovery was sort of the testing ground for AI and supporting legal practice. And it feels like those companies were ahead of the curve, either by ability or just by seeing the opportunity in thinking about how to use AI or at least machine learning to improve the process of discovery, which can be an extremely manual, repetitive process. Does that click for you? Or did you go even further back in time to think of the origin story for machine learning and legal practice?
No, I mean, I think I agree with you there. I think e-discovery vendors were really on the forefront of using technology in that way. I think because it does deal directly with data, both on the vendor side and then the law firm side. So any sort of discovery practitioner, definitely well placed to both understand the implications of AI and how it can help and drive that forward in the practice of people. So for your listeners who might not know how AI applies within e-discovery, for instance, police have since 2010 that there's been something called TAR, technology assisted review. And that's using machine learning to, as you said, decrease the amount of directory in reviewing these documents. So not generative AI, but machine learning. So you have to train the system on what good looks like. And then once you train it, it can reduce the number of documents to be reviewed. Or it could say, okay, these documents are the ones that are relevant. We're just going to do a privilege. Right? It's going to reduce the number of people needed to review this document. And it's very interesting because with TAR, what do you, as a vendor, sometimes come up upon resistance to attorneys using it, either because they didn't understand it, they didn't trust it, or maybe they just wanted to bill those hours, which as an in-house counsel, no, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts and opinions on that.
I had thoughts about that when I was outside counsel, to be clear.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I'd love to hear those. But it's very interesting that even, it's hard. There are people who are like, yes, absolutely. Let's use this. I think especially in matters like, for instance, you in antitrust, I'm not sure if you were working on second request or anything like that, where time is of the essence. So being more open to using that kind of technology, whereas I found in other practice groups, there was less willingness. So for instance, translation, a lot of people in other practice groups may be less apt to use machine translation, for instance, which now there's a degree of generative AI use in that, but before prior machine translation, people were still a little wary of using that. But now you
Yeah.
don't see that as much.
I think about e-discovery for the exact reason that you just mentioned, which is, to me, as a practicing lawyer, it was the first time I saw technology bumping up against the culture that exists with lawyers in terms of just some general resistance to change. Trust in technology is a really good way to put it, I think, Emma. And secondly, bumping up against business model, meaning, okay, if you have an army of associates reviewing documents and now you have a technology that can automate that, how do you convert that into your business model and remain profitable? So again, when I think back of my history using technology as a lawyer, that was the moment where you saw the technology really get pushed to the outer edge of what was capable because you didn't have machine learning in legal practice, meaning maybe you had it somewhere in the billing or you had it somewhere in procurement. I don't remember having it really embedded in my legal practice except for e-discovery. And at the same time, I was seeing some of the resistance and really surprised at how long it took for things like TAR to become mainstream, in part because of case law developments, but really also because of the cultural and business model challenges.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely right. The challenge to the culture and business model, I think, can't be overstated with any sort of technological change. So I compare it, for instance, to legal research. So I started my career at law library. Legal research, it used to be that you'd have to have these large physical law library within your firm to do any sort of legal research. But then that started to change as Westlaw and Lexis started digitizing and really democratizing that and then changing it in a way that did change the business model a lot, where you started getting a lot of in-house counsel as part of their billing guidelines to outside counsel saying they wouldn't pay for research. They're saying, well, you have access to Westlaw and Lexis. Why would I pay for research? I'm not going to pay for research. I think that would be a good example of it. But to your point, with TAR and now with a lot of these generative AI review platforms, so you're seeing it only the big platforms like Relativity has Error, where they could do a generative AI review. So that's a challenge then too, because then you're not recouping any of those costs in the contract, right? You don't need as many staff attorneys, or you can't bill out the contract attorneys you hired from your vendor and a couple dollars extra on top of them.
So let's focus on AI powered
Hmm.
technology, is expanding into legal practice. We can stay with a law firm, legal research, maybe even brief writing, really core activity that junior or even mid level associates have been performing. Just the way that e-discovery chipped away at that. If we anticipate the same challenges for these new technologies that we saw with e-discovery, what do you think that means for the future business model, revenue model for law firms?
So you were an associate at a large law firm. Did you find the use of technologies as a review in e-discovery to decrease your work at all?
It's a great question. I would depend on my level of seniority.
Hmm.
I think the more senior I was, the less it would be replacing my time because my time was more overseeing or strategic or issue spotting or planning out what needs to be the focus of the review, et cetera. Taking the results of that review and turning it into an important analysis that's then relied upon to make decisions in the case, for example. I think the more junior I was, the more, yes, that would be to
Okay.
me a one for one replacement of work. So does that mean that I'm sitting around with nothing to do? No, because there's a certain level of attrition that happens at law firms and it's rebalancing of the ranks to accommodate capacity and need. But I think at some level of being a junior lawyer, you could find substitution between the time that was spent on something and the task that was being conducted by the TAR review.
Gotcha. So to ask that, because I think a lot of time when we talk about generative AI tools, because they're doing so much more than past legal technology tools did, this idea that it is going to completely 100% take away work that attorneys have been traditionally doing. But I think looking backward at an example of as we have in e-discovery, that it does take away work if you're a contract, right? Like now would be the worst time ever to go with contract attorney. I would not recommend it to anyone. I think if you're a senior review manager or project manager, you're probably okay because there's still going to be some need for your small teams, but that would be a terrible time. But for associates, where law firms mainly make their money, you said that it was taking away some of your work as a junior, but you were able to find other work because that's how a law firm works. Is that if you are not at capacity at something and you're competent, you can find work to do. So how does that translate then to the business model? I think it could go a couple of different ways. So I'm still not sure if the billable hours going anywhere. I mean, ideally it would be, right? Because it's such a silly way, especially coming from the outside in, where telling people that the most you can make is just the most you can work, which doesn't seem like a good way to leverage your knowledge and expertise, right? The fact that law firms don't prioritize their knowledge base and experience and they don't leverage that to a degree limits the amount of money, right? And there just has to be a better way. But law firms in general, I think, aren't very good at evaluating the value of their services and then the outcomes of those services. So then they just put a number next to their billable. So saying like, okay, Kai, you're a third year associate. This is how much we're going to bill you out at. This is an 8-year associate. We're going to bill them out at this. Partner level, we're going to bill them out at this. Instead of thinking about, okay, what is the value of the service we're offering to our client? Or is there a way we can leverage experience how to do that? So with AI, theoretically, you could do that, right? Like you don't have to do a lot of these drudgery tasks, quote unquote. You could, if you label, if they law firms are honest about knowledge management and labeling their data, they could potentially productize and leverage the work they've done before. But there's a couple limitations there, right? So you have bar association rules and courts that still use the billable hour requirement. So if you're trying to recoup fees, you still have to show how many hours you billed. That's the only way that a court is going to look at it. Bar associations operate on the assumption that you're doing an billable hour, right? So there'd have to be some sort of structural change there. But I think a lot of the savvier firms could figure out ways how to productize, or maybe some of the smaller firms figure out how to leverage that knowledge base, or even go to value based pricing. Because if they want to look at outcome, right? If they want to accelerate the deal velocity, they want the deal to close and say, like, okay, we can get this done for you in this amount of time, but it's going to cost you this percentage, or it's going to cost you X. And I think there's potential to do that with AI because it can operate potentially a little leaner or potentially more strategic. You don't have to do the surgery work. So, for instance, there are products out there now that for transactions that you can really supercharge, for instance, the due diligence process. So if you do that and say, okay, I can get your deal done faster and we'll be able to review and, craft all these more complex term sheets and things like that. Oh, we're going to need 3%. I think that's a compelling offer for a lot of law firms.
It's interesting because the poster child for charging a percentage-based fee, at least on the M&A side, is one of the most premium practices that exists, Walktel, and they're
Yeah.
known for charging percentage-based fees. So it would be very interesting to see if technology opens up that as an option for other firms, even like you
hmm
said, smaller, medium-sized. And maybe that is a good opening to push this to what I view as the sort of extreme, which is AI law firm or the AI powered law firm. You got a post on LinkedIn recently that got a lot of discussion around this. And one of the things that I think about is on the topic of billable hours, the last person to predict the demise of the billable hour. I think people have tried to predict that and say that many, many, many times now, and it failed. It has survived, I think, for some rational reasons, to be fair. And so when I think of the billable hour surviving into the future, perhaps it is a hyper rationalized billable hour where a senior lawyer with a lot of technology behind them is billing $10,000 an hour. Okay, let's just pretend. And that still might compare favorably in terms of a cost impact to the client. If you compare that to a current system where it's, 2,000 for the partner, 1,500 for the senior, whatever, it kind of adds up. So maybe that's one way the billable hour survives, is that it just gets a lot higher and it becomes more a reflection of the market value of that senior level person. And then everything else is, like you say, it's kind of, well, maybe not productized, but it's kind of just built into the price, right? They're not charging you for the fact that they're using really cool tools to be really efficient and fast. There's just one number that you pay, which is the billable hour for the senior lawyer that's overseeing the whole thing. Would love to hear your thoughts on that, but more generally, would love to just talk about AI law firms and what you think they are and where you think they're headed.
Sure thing. So I think to your point, I could definitely see that happening. And I think you see that happen anytime you see these law firms that are made up of former partners at Am Law 100 firms that go over there because they want to be able to charge less and have less overhead. I think baking the price completely into your hourly billing makes sense. And it's actually surprising to me to a degree that law firms don't do more of that already. So I'm sure you see, for instance, on your bills, well, you'll see all the various charges for things. They charge for their expenses, research costs, any sort of thing instead of just building in the overhead. It gets to a point where you're asking yourself, well, are you going to bill me for the rent on your office space that you needed to use? I think I could definitely see that happening because a senior attorney would be able to delegate a lot to AI. But that also brings up the big existential question is then where are we going to get all of these senior attorneys from after they retire? How are you going to train as a junior attorney if you don't have all of this ability to do this? So, and if you graduate law school and hang your shingle out, you're not going to be getting that $10,000. It's much tougher as a solo to learn those kind of niche, high value practices versus the solos who start out after law school doing personal injury, family law, small town general practice, which is much easier for people to get clients that way. So I think, that's kind of what I'm worried. In terms of the AI-driven law firm, I think it's a spectrum, right? So I had posted that, maybe to be a little provocative, but it's just of interest to me that there's this big push, especially by venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. I believe it was Y Combinator that had a post where they're looking for new startups, but they're looking for full stack AI. So they don't want necessarily just an AI-driven legal product. They want full stack AI that is full stack law firm, right? So basically a platform that can do everything for the lawyer. And I thought that was interesting. And as we're in the US and you're loosening up restrictions on owning law firms, I was wondering, why hasn't somebody started one of these yet in Arizona or Puerto Rico? Because they have the lessening of the rules. And so far, there's only been one announcement of one alleged AI-driven law firm, Crosby, and that's in New York. And so I don't know when that is going to happen. I'd play around with a lot of these rules. No, if they're quite there yet to have one person, like one or two attorneys really driving that, but it could be, right? And I think there's the other part of the spectrum where if you're a law firm or you're solo, you can sit down and really be honest with yourself about where your strengths and weaknesses are, and then find the AI tools to make up for those weaknesses. So if you're solo, maybe it's an intake. You're on one person. So getting some sort of practice management tool, intake tool that's AI driven is going to be a really good investment. It's going to supercharge your practice. Or maybe you have a high volume transactions practice. So having the contract drafting AI tool is going to be really helpful to do. So figure I think that's the spectrum we're on right now, to the point where we're going to see where somebody is just going to have a platform and going to be able to do it all.
Yeah, I wonder if that is anticipating some major leap in the technology to a more kind of general AI that can really do it all for you. Because right
Yeah.
now, it seems like the legal tech market is very much focused on tackling concrete tasks, tackling specific problems, and offering tools that solve very particular needs. And the idea that someone can develop a platform that can do it all, maybe it's possible for some kind of work. I don't know, maybe something less technical, less expansive than large corporate M&A or huge litigation, for example. But certainly so far, it doesn't seem like the vendors are coming out with anything that would suggest the ability to just create an all-in-one kind of platform.
I think going narrow and niche makes sense in the context of how lawyers work, for instance. So it's interesting talking to although there have been a lot of technologists, for instance, getting into legal technology who don't have a legal background. So they approach it much differently. And I think a lot don't really understand how lawyers work, and that a corporate attorney's needs are going to be completely different than a litigator's. Their practice is completely different. Their tools are completely different. Their needs are completely different. Right? Litigation is inherently an adversarial practice. They need much, much different tools. So, for instance, bias in LLMs is actually useful for a litigator because they can test out their arguments on an LLM and hear that bias and hear it push back. Whereas for somebody involved in transactions, usually they want to get the done. So the bias isn't actually helpful for them. They need different tools. And for them, speed is more important. So platforms that are trying to be everything to everybody are tougher. Whereas you are seeing some platforms that are focused more just on transactional attorneys or family law attorneys or litigators or things like that. They're trying to be a platform for a specific practice group or particular practice, which I think is the balance between going really narrow and niche and still having a platform. What's of interest to me is that there are a lot of these legal technology companies that are B2C. So they're marketing themselves towards selling themselves to lawyers, but they're finding a lot of clients that are pro se litigants, can't afford a lawyer because in the US we have a huge access to justice issue. So they can't afford a lawyer. And instead of using ChatGPT or just trying it out themselves or legal zooming it, they find one of these platforms, legal research or drafting tools, and do it for them themselves. And that's very interesting because I think that's going up very, very close to the edge of unauthorized practice of law. But it is solving this access to justice issue for the attorney who's using these types of tools. They can read through it and be like, okay, I like this argument. I don't like this argument, or like, this is not how I rate it. Let me refresh it. Whereas a layperson might not do that or might not know that's not a good argument or might not know, hey, let me go read this case and make sure the citation actually says what it's supposed to say.
When I think of the potential for an AI law firm, I agree. It's something closer to B2C, where the C is not necessarily a consumer, but it could be just a sole proprietor, right? There could be a B2B just where the B is one person, right? Many
Yeah.
businesses are one person who has a small business that they run themselves. And they use things like LegalZoom. They use templates. They Google examples of contracts and use them all the time. And I have to cop to the fact that I have a huge blind spot as a corporate lawyer who's worked in large corporate practice his whole life. But even I have to acknowledge as a corporate lawyer, there's always a cost to benefit analysis in making a legal decision. You're never spending every last dollar for the absolute perfect solution and answer. You're always balancing, what do I need? What does this cost? What is the risk if it's wrong? You're always engaged in that kind of balancing act. A purchaser of legal services, no matter how sophisticated or not, is making that kind of calculus. And what that means to me is it's completely makes sense that some people will say, for this particular task, I don't need to hire a traditional law firm. An AI law firm is good enough. Or pulling a template from the internet is good enough. Is it perfect? No. Do I know it's not perfect? Yes, I know that. Do I know that maybe possibly some commercial deal comes back to bite me later? I know that in the back of my mind. I'm taking that risk because that's what you do when you're in a business context all the time. And again, you have more resources at a bigger corporation. You obviously are making a different risk calculus, but you're always in some way calibrating your purchase of legal services to some sort of pragmatic cost benefit analysis. So if that's the case, then it's no surprise to me, frankly, that a sole proprietor would be happy to go to an AI law firm, let's call it, and get a super simple trademark application in, or get an NDA contract put together, or something like that. It doesn't surprise me. Now, like you said, there's this ethics question, there's a practice of law question. I'm not going to sort of opine on that. But from a business perspective, I could see it being something that a large amount of people want. And frankly, people who may not spend money on a lawyer at all in the but-for world, as we call it, meaning these are people who, if they don't have an AI law firm, may not hire anyone or pay anyone. And that way, it really could be growing the pie, it could be growing the market and not just shifting business from one provider to another.
A lot of the conversations talk about the top of the market, right? Like what's going to happen to Am Law 100 for law firms. But to your point, I think you're right that it is going to increase the share of people getting access to legal resources. And I think that's going to help lawyers and the bottom. There's just so many lawyers out there who are underemployed or unemployed and don't have these big law firms, right? They don't get these big law jobs or even mid-level law firm, but maybe they can put their shingle out and maybe they can find a specialization. So I always think about perfect estate planning. I have small children, so I'm on all of these local parent listservs, and at least once a week, somebody asks, "Hey, who do people use for a will or just very basic estate planning? I don't have anything crazy. I just need something. What do you use?" And then people give suggestions, and there's just a wide range of suggestions for both experiences, whether they recommend an actual law firm or they recommend a solo, or like, oh, actually, I got a template from this website. It's really easy. You can do it this way. And I think those are a lot of the consumers that are being missed out in the current legal market. They include myself in that. I worked in legal for almost 20 years. I'm not a regular buyer of legal services. But if it were more accessible, I probably would use it more often, both for estate planning or I'm a small business owner. If I have a contract now, I just review it myself. Or if there's something a little iffy, maybe then I'll get it reviewed. But for the most part, you said the risk reward where I'm like, okay, is it worth it for me to pay somebody to go look at this? No, this was fine. I don't think this is going to bite me in the butt. Let me.
I think estate
Yeah.
planning is a great example because people know what the risks they're taking, I think,
Hmm.
and often, meaning if you are in your early 30s, you have your first child, and all you want to do is just make sure I can avoid probate. I've heard enough to know probate can take a long
Yeah.
time. It costs money. If something happens, I just want to make sure everything passes quickly. Maybe that's something you're willing to do without hiring a lawyer. Maybe it's through the assistive technology. But, maybe then later you're 40, 50, 60. Maybe your situation is more complicated. Maybe now you're thinking about Medicaid planning because you have an elder parent who needs care. You might decide at that point, at that stage, I don't know if I want to risk it. And maybe I'll hire a lawyer and make sure everything's done exactly right. I think a lot of people make that kind of cost benefit analysis all the time.
Hmm.
Maybe they don't think of it that way, but I think they do it in some sense. And giving them the option to use technology in the context of weighing the pluses and minuses to decide, I'd rather just pay $500 to some TurboTax sort of offering on the internet that does legal services. That seems to me like not the worst thing for people in general who need legal services.
I think that's exactly right. And I would even extend that further that if somebody in their early 30s knows intellectually, oh, I should get a will, and it's difficult or expensive, they might not even bother doing that. And then when they're older and have even more estate issues that they need to handle, either it's going to be more expensive for them when they try to figure that out, or they're just not going to do it. And that's why we have such a probate issue in our country. But I love your example then of TurboTax. That is such a good example. So I was thinking a lot about TurboTax that I've heard some of these platforms that compare themselves. Like we want to be the TurboTax of legal. And it's interesting because financial services is also heavily regulated. And we still manage to have these consumer facing products and the sky has not fallen. There hasn't been this huge increase in tax fraud by just making it easy for me to pay a relatively nominal amount of money to file my taxes every year versus using an accountant. And interestingly enough, I looked into this because I was wondering what it would look like. The number of accountants has actually gone up since TurboTax was introduced in 1984. I think the news of the legal industry dying has been exaggerated. If you were a lower level of, right, if you were still just doing simple filings for people, maybe your business is affected. But people are realizing, okay, I can't do my taxes here and I have more complex issue, which is a more expensive issue to figure out. They go to a professional and that increases the need for professionals.
It is a good analog. I mean, even when I think of
Yeah.
my own experience, when I was coming out of law school, I had income, I had debt. I used TurboTax or just
Yeah.
TaxSlayer. For many years, I used those products. And it was fine. It was perfect. It did the job. Over time, things have gotten way more complicated in life. My wife is a small business owner. We do have an elder parent who needs help with at-home care, and things have gotten really complex. I've actually started using an accountant because of the complexity. As a consumer, I like having those two options. I like that accountants are still there. I don't mind at this point paying the money to hire an accountant who's good and who can do that more complex work. For a long time, when my situation was simpler, I was able to save some money and frankly, save a lot of time and headache as well by using one of these tax preparation tools. Because whether it's tax preparation, whether it's wills, part of it is just the time it takes to do it
Mhm.
is a barrier. You late on your taxes because you just didn't get to it, or you don't do a will because you just, oh my gosh, I got to go to meet a lawyer. I got to go sit down. I got to pull some documents. Then I got to get a notary. I got to go into the city. It's this whole thing. And in the end, like you said, you may just end up not getting a will. And that's not good for anyone.
Yeah, exactly. Or to your point, you're late on your taxes.
Yeah.
Funny enough. So you're paying not only as it gets more complex, but for instance, with taxes, theoretically, you could still do your taxes, right? You could get those little booklets, you could start pulling them out. have your whole dinner table full with all of your different documents trying to figure it out, that's going to take hours and hours and hours of your time. And you might not get it right because you don't do this every day. You're not a professional, but being able to buy back your time and make sure it's done correctly is very powerful. And the same thing, with a will or anything like that. I think also family laws are the right place for this kind of disruption. So if you have a non-contested divorce, right, and you already know maybe you don't have any property or children, so this is going to be really easy. Why aren't we making it easier for people to do that, right? Instead of having to hire attorneys
Yeah.
and making that, or even if you do have a contested divorce, right? Like being able to do some of that yourself, and then or having the AI powered law firm to your point, having an attorney say, okay, you can pay me to do this part, but here's a platform where you can do these other things, or I need you to upload these documents or make these summaries for me and do this for me, and then I will be this other part for you and make it affordable for people.
Earlier, when we were talking about the junior attorney and doc review and TAR, the complete answer to your earlier question is even when there's a substitution between the work that a lawyer does and the work that technology can do instead, it's never at the exact same moment. There's a lag, right? Meaning it's never that the technology comes to the picture and at that moment, it replaces what all the junior lawyers are doing on that particular task. There's a delay there where what really happens is the technology starts to get rolled out. Law firms are sophisticated businesses. They can see that that's going to have an impact on their need for junior associates. So they start maybe hiring differently with their next class of 2Ls. Maybe there's fewer junior associate positions, but maybe there's more legal operations positions. Maybe the CIO now has a few more FTEs in his or her budget to hire someone for their office. So it's never an instantaneous thing where a vendor shows up with a cool technology and all of a sudden 3 associates are pushed out. It sort of happens over time in a more organic kind of way where I think you don't see the substitution directly, even though it's happening.
Yeah, no, I agree there. And I think that points to a couple of issues in law firms, I would say, on both mid-size and big law. So I think it's interesting you say they're sophisticated businesses. I think that definitely depends on the law firm. The partnership model, I think, leads to a lot of very interesting business decisions because depending on the firm, different firms operate in different ways and technology decisions are made in different ways. Sometimes the technology might just be for a practice group. Sometimes they might personally make decisions for the firm. There's no one size fits all because with the partnership model, everyone has different degrees of power. It's very interesting talking to legal tech companies about that because one of the questions I get a lot, consulting business, is okay, well, how do you sell to a big law firm? And my answer is always, well, it depends. Who you're talking to and what your product is. There's no one way. In all fairness, it's like any sort of enterprise sale to a large corporation. Not every large corporation can be sold to the same way. But in terms of technology, I think in law firms, it's not always deployed equally between practice groups or between cities. For instance, antitrust, right? It's like, oh, okay, the Spurs antitrust practice group, they must all work as one, right? Well, no, you hire a partner, the partner puts together their team, and sometimes they work together with other partners. And because partners can have business portable, it makes it much more difficult to make then those kind of like high level technology decisions or high level staffing decisions than you would in other types of businesses.
This came to me too late in my career to really understand it in time to make use of it. But you take a large corporate law firm, 1,000 lawyers, maybe 2,000 lawyers. That is actually 2,000 solo practitioners. And that really is the partnership model, right? Is each person is in some way a solo practitioner. Now, of course, there's joint overhead, right? There's savings from that. Of course, there's cross-selling to each other's practices. Of course, there's synergies, et cetera. But ultimately, a law firm is a combination of many people who are building and developing their own practice. And that creates all sorts of strange incentives that you don't see in other industries, which don't operate that way. If we could stay for a second in my safe bubble of corporate practice, I'd be curious, do you think it makes sense for corporate law firms to act as incubators for technology or to make venture style investments in tech startups as opposed to waiting and seeing what comes out in the market and buying it when it comes out?
I would say yes. I think to a degree it makes sense because then you can craft a product to how you want it, right? So let's say I want to make sure I have a product that's specifically built for my M&A transactions group. Investing in the people doing it, I think is a good idea. But I think the issue then becomes when they want to sell it to other firms. It creates a weird incentive because that's then no longer your value add, right? So you're investing in it, you get it built exactly the way you want it. But then when it goes off into the world, it is very interesting that that's not part of your reach anymore. And to me, it is also interesting from the partnership model perspective that it's like, okay, we're investing in new kinds of technologies and things like that. We may or may not get a return on that investment. But I think it makes sense in the short term for firms to do that, right? Because they're getting access to these technologies early. There's a potential ROI in selling them, but then long term, maybe not, because then you don't have
Mm.
the value add from putting it that way. I will say the difference is then there are firms who are building their own in-house, which you can do much easier now with like N8, N9 or Manus, where you can create your own agent orchestrations, for instance. I think that is very powerful. And I think something more firms should look into instead of necessarily looking out of what to buy. If they don't see something in the market, maybe see if they can build it themselves.
If I were to pluck a random AmLaw 100 firm out of a hat, chances are maybe they should not be thinking about doing these things because they probably are not nimble enough. They probably don't have the right infrastructure. They probably don't have the right management. Maybe they don't have the right practice to fit it. But having said that, I imagine the kinds of firms that are thinking about incubating or thinking about building instead of buying, I imagine there's a selection bias there, that they are firms that are on the opposite of that spectrum. They are the ones that have more ability to pull this off because really what it takes is technical know-how. It takes resources, it takes commitment, it takes acting quickly, right? Because the technology changes so fast that you could easily develop something that is obsolete by the time you roll it out. So I can think of law firms or leadership of certain law firms that would be well suited for that. But then I would be very concerned about the average AmLaw 100 taking on that strategy
I think
successfully.
that's very fair. And I think the ones who are doing it, we see that self-selection
Yeah, that makes
for
such a
sure. And it's interesting because those are the same law firms who already, for the most part, are working with technology companies, for instance, and already do this to their clients.
exactly. And your point about losing the competitive edge if you start licensing the product is an interesting one. But if we think about these sorts of law firms being more embedded in the tech culture or tech approach to running a business, it also makes me think of open source, right? Where in
Mhm.
the tech space, there are many who advocate for and embrace the open source approach because they do not fear losing the competitive edge. They instead look at what they gain from having wider adoption of a certain kind of standard, for example. So perhaps law firms are able to take that view as well.
I'm a big believer in open source and I work a lot of that with my venture, right? So that I think open sourcing the way you do something can be really powerful because then you're seen as a leader, right? And then if you have the same standard and everyone's following that standard, then you make everything a lot easier. I think the proprietary part then is how you execute on it. And that a lot of times is the technology. I am interested by law firms who are looking to make tools for their in-house counsel clients. I think that's an interesting model. A lot of legal technology companies are completely bypassing software. Their ideal customer profile is the income because they're saying, oh, you don't decrease your outside counsel costs by using my magic platform. No, they don't say magic platform, but by using all our tools and platforms, your outside counsel will have to bill you as much. I think to a degree, some of that might work, but I think it's interesting if law firms want to add value to their in-house counsel, like creating tools for them to use, I think is a cool way for them to stay sticky, but while still adding value.
I will say from an in-house perspective, there's also the challenge of procurement and onboarding a vendor and the InfoSec concerns.
Mhm.
Once you've retained a sophisticated corporate law firm and vetted them and you have a relationship built up, there's trust, you can trust their systems and you have in place ways of sending them data, receiving data that you feel good about. It almost might be easier for the law firm to deploy some of these tools and either offer them to the client or resell them or something like that. Because for a legal corporate to onboard a new vendor can take a lot of time and it can be very difficult to get over those security concerns, which again, you clear that hurdle with the law firm. So that actually might give law firms a bit of an advantage over a vendor's attempt to try to sell directly to the client, at least in some contexts.
No, I think that touches on a really important point. So the trust issue, right? So I think the new entrants to legal technology don't really understand the value of hiring an attorney to some degree, right? It's not necessarily just writing briefs or reviewing the contracts to work. It's a system of trust and having trusted advice and having that respect, right? Or having and knowing, okay, I'm getting trusted advice from this person so I can make an intelligent business decision. I think there's that. To your point about onboarding a vendor, it makes me think back to e-discovery, actually. So before the Great Recession, basically no corporations had a relationship with an e-discovery vendor. They weren't thinking about that. They just said, my law firm takes care of that. I don't think about that. But then afterwards, people were looking at costs and ways of being more efficient and thinking about data security and security, information governance. A lot of e-discovery vendors, especially the big ones, have been able to get embedded into these large corporations. These corporations have a panel where they say, okay, to their outside counsel, you have to use one of these three, or they just have one and say, okay, well, I hope you're not conflicted out with our vendor because this is the vendor we use in these litigation. And I wonder with legal technology if it could go that way as well, where maybe in-house you have your own contract drafting tool or you have some sort of litigation research tool or something that's built specifically for your in-house. And then you just call your outside counsel. Oh, by the way,
I think
and just
selling these products is extremely complicated. And I'm sure something you get questions on all the time, good go to market of selling to a law firm versus selling to a corporate. Each has its very unique challenges and friction points.
yes, absolutely. The value propositions are different for both, right? The law firm, they're looking to make money. The in-house counsel, they're looking to save money, but they're also looking to, again, disperse that risk and create that chips.
Yeah. And in-house lawyers, ultimately, they're accountable to someone for their decisions.
Yeah,
And so that trust is a part of them making sure that when they make a decision of who to hire or what technology to use to answer a legal question that is informing either a legal decision or a business decision at a large corporate, they're going to be accountable for that. So they want to make sure that whatever they're using or whoever they're relying on is going to give a good, accurate answer. So
exactly.
Emma, thank you so much. Why don't we leave it there? I think that was a great conversation. Tell us, how can listeners reach you? Quad K, what's the best way to track you
Yeah,
guys?
you can connect with me on LinkedIn. My name is Emma Kelly. And you can also shoot me an email at emma@quadk.co. So that's EMMAQUADA.co.
Excellent. Look forward to following your posts on LinkedIn. They seem to get a lot of engagement. So Keep at it. Always learn something from these conversations as well. So thanks again for coming on.
All right. Thanks, Kai. I really appreciated it. I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Version Up. Thanks for listening. The Up is brought to you by me, Kai Rosga, with music by Brett Ryback.